doing, Jim? Nice to see you too.
How's your temper doing? Okay. What are you going to do for the holidays, do you know?
I don't know yet.
Oh, okay. So I don't have to buy anything new for the holidays, right?
Wait a minute, and you only have to dress this much.
Marsha, I need to find this very cool. Already launched, and someone just said hello from South Africa.
Oh my God.
They're watching the program.
Wow.
Let us know.
Oh, let me ask you something. So can people watch it like later on today too? How long will it be available?
Forever, as far as I know.
Oh.
It'll be a link that they can go to
Oh,
on our...
good, because my son asked me. He said, can I see it later on? And I said, I don't know how they're doing
It
it.
should record when it's done and then be on our YouTube page.
Oh,
So that it can share. The JCC. We have a live tour right now on the camera from South Africa. So that's pretty cool, huh?
Are they from Youngstown?
Yeah. My chances are yes.
Now, who would be in South Africa?
A family member of somebody.
They have exercise classes too. I mean, I don't know if they're doing it now
Hello there.
I don't take two exercise classes.
No, that's okay.
Alexandra Pearl.
How are you, Taylor?
Good, how you? Well, we are too. We got one of those.
I had hip surgery.
Did you?
Grab me nuts.
Both? I had one of those too.
Not fun, is it?
One was easy.
That one was easy, but that one's not.
Oh, okay.
Which one was easy?
Right here.
Say, you were in the front.
And I guess you don't just get as much as you do here. It's so
Everybody I know had those. Yeah, I had both.
People are coming out with some really cute masks.
Oh, yeah.
Now, the more we get into this, the more it is. Now, in your building, walking down the hall, they have for a while, their visitors were not, only families supposed to visit, but visitors were not. Fran, or either Fran or called the Youngstown Health Department, and they came out with signs up that you must wear that. Well, yeah, I did that to all because I meant it. Nobody in the store. But that's literally, yeah. Nobody in the store. And they had to knock it off. So I called the health department the next time I went in. There was a sign, was there a sign on the door? So we have great big laminated signs. Yeah, I think they do now.
See, I do nothing. Not work out. I
Don't come over, I'll have to put this on.
Thank you, but you have to go.
Yes, nice to see you.
Trouble with sitting in the front, you don't see anybody.
It's hard to tell, except if you know body types.
We have the majority.
There were 38 registers.
38? Oh, wow. That's pretty good, because I thought they could only fit the 30 in here.
Oh, they said 40.
Oh, okay.
Where are you going?
But there's a lot of empty space.
Yes.
Well, I think they only set up in today.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, trying to see.
No, it isn't on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. It's really nice to see you here. We're keeping all the safety measurements, yet the room is full, and it's very, very nice for me to see all of you. Once again, per usual, I would like to thank Marsha Levy for her donation. This makes everything possible, made this all happen. Our viewers at home, welcome as well. I encourage you, if you feel like you don't hear or don't see, please respond online. We are watching and making sure that you can also enjoy this lecture even though your presence is not here. This room will be a little darker than usual so the people at home can see the slideshow and hear the speaker. And without further ado, I will not even tell you about all the great programs we're going to have, but I will just encourage you, please grab a copy of the program guide, which will get done and printed to you by next week. Follow up on everything we have to offer in this campus and in Logan. And other than that, I don't want to say too much more. Our speaker, very special. She came from?
Well, today I came from Kent.
From Canton, but you made your way from where?
The other day from Vermont.
From Vermont. Okay, so thank you for making all the way here. I will let you introduce yourself. And of course, after the talk, we'll have time for questions. So please, I will just step backwards and you can
Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here. I was telling Ari as I was walking in, my grandmother, my nanny, would be beyond thrilled that this lecture is happening at a JCC. She spent like every afternoon of her life, at least when I was a child, watching her at her JCC in El Paso, Texas, swimming and playing table tennis and really enjoying the Jewish community there. So, yeah, so I hope that you have not come here today or are watching on YouTube to learn more details about the Titanic. Because the truth is, I am not an expert. Oh, that's a little too much. I am not an expert on the Titanic. I happen to have a grandfather who was a little boy on the Titanic. And so the frame for this talk today is really about my family and our story. And that's what I was told was okay to do. I'm not an expert on the Titanic, but I am a rabbi, and so that means that I am an expert on stories and the ways that we make meaning out of our stories and our family legacy and our legacy of our peoples and our ancestors. So that's very much the approach I'm going to be taking today. And as the gentleman said, there will be time at the end for some question and answer. Although again, I'm really not standing here as an expert on what happened on April 15th, 1912. Rather, what happened to my family and how did that play out in our family. So I titled my talk, My Grandfather Was a Little Boy on the Titanic. And there's a lot in this statement. I started noticing as a young adult that, it's sort of like a cocktail party trick, like everybody's interested when you say that your grandfather was on the Titanic. And what I noticed was no matter what I said to open the conversation, the first thing everybody would say is, did he survive? And what I kind of made, I really don't enjoy small talk very much, so I kind of started making it into a little bit of a game, where I would very specifically say, my grandfather was a little boy on the Titanic. And they would say, did he survive? And I would just look at them again and say, my grandfather was a little boy on the Titanic. And so, depending on the person, it would take them a minute to kind of catch on. There's so much of this, the overall narrative, the overall story of the Titanic has so much to do with survival. And I guess that's probably why people are so entranced by it as a story. As a story, it has so much power that I really, until 2012, and we had the 100th anniversary, which I'm going to be speaking quite a bit about, actually, of what my family newly discovered in 2012 that we didn't know before. I never quite understood why is everyone so interested in this one particular thing that happened in history that my family happens to be connected to. But that said, family stories are powerful, no matter what your family. So I want to invite everybody here today and everyone here on YouTube that as I'm talking about my family story, I really want to invite you to think about your family stories also, and themes of survival and overcoming hardship, because we are all survivors one way or another. Just that we are here means that our ancestors did a lot of stuff to enable us to get here and really moved through a lot of difficulty. So it would delight me so much if you could keep that in mind as well, of what your own family stories are, and let those kind of invite those to this room. And yeah, it's really wild doing this under our social distancing, but hi everyone. So I'm Rabbi Lee Moore, I forgot to say my name. How do I make it go to the next one? I go like this. Okay, so this is me sitting in my grandmother's lap, my nanny. And my poppy is the little boy who was on the Titanic. This is somewhere in early 70s, probably 1974, I would guess. And there's my brother. And this is in Kent, when my grandparents came to visit our family. And as you can tell, I'm trying to shush my grandmother. I'm trying to make her stop talking in this picture, which is part of why I love it. And yeah, there's my poppy. So Meier Moor, and for those of you who may be Titanic interested people, this is he's listed on the ship's passenger log as Master Meier Moor. He was 7 years old at the time. In this picture, my brother is a couple years, he's probably about 5 or so, and I'm maybe about 2. And when my grandfather passed away, my poppy, which was just a couple years after this, my brother was the same age that my poppy had been when he was on the Titanic. So there's something about that, those themes that can weave themselves through families like that. I want to say very clearly, even though what I'm going to be speaking about today are my family stories, literally every single person in my family would probably do this differently than I would, right? And isn't that how it is with family stories? The nature of stories is we latch on to the thing that we're interested in, and then we dwell there. And that makes sense, and that's good. There's nothing wrong with that. But it means that when there's a story around which there's a lot of mystery, and a lot of openness, and you don't know exactly what happened, you can end up with a lot of different versions. As I was preparing for today and looking around online, there are multiple versions of ideas around what happened with my grandfather and my great-grandmother. So I'm going to share some of those today, but just this caveat, the story I'm telling today, like me shushing my nanny, this is my time to talk, okay? So this is me talking, and it may be, like if my brother were standing up here, he would do it in a totally different way. And that's fine, there's nothing wrong with that. The fact that family stories have different versions is part of what it means to be in a family, right? And let the stories kind of kind of develop. So here are Baila and Meier. So Baila is my great-grandmother. When she took my grandfather onto the Titanic, they came over to this country as immigrants. My grandfather was born in 1904, and we don't know exactly where. This is one of the mysteries. My great-grandmother would often say Romania. We know it was somewhere in the Russian influence because her husband, my grandfather's father, was conscripted into the Russian army to fight in the Russian-Japanese War. So I only learned really in the last 10 years that this was, this time around 1905 to 1907, the time of this war, was truly a horrible time for a lot of Jewish folks in the area because a lot of Jewish men were conscripted into the Russian army. And so what essentially happened from my great-grandmother's perspective was that the Russian army came along and took away her husband, and that was it, and she never saw him again. We don't know, did he die in the war? We don't know. The research I was doing for today saw that Jews could be conscripted into the Russian army for up to 25 years. And they could be taken from the age of 12. And she was looking at that reality that her husband had been taken away from her. You know, my grandfather must have barely known his father because he was born in 1904. And she looked at this particular kind of anti-Semitism and she's like, I gotta get out of here now. And so part of the family story is that she, escaped in a wagon across Europe. She had relatives in England, so she headed to England. But was she hiding under hay bales in a wagon? I don't know. That's our family story. We can imagine that she was in England for a little while. Again, different Titanic sites will say they were in England for 10 months, but I have no idea if that's really the case. It may have been longer. She and my grandfather came across on a boat from Antwerp to Quebec and were trying to immigrate to this country. Something happened and they got sent back. So they were immigrants that were refused at the border. But in that case, the border was the ocean. So then they had to go all the way across the Atlantic back to England. So when they came on the Titanic, it was actually their second attempt to immigrate to this country. And in fact, they were not supposed to come on the Titanic. They were supposed to come on a boat called the Adriatic. And I don't exactly know the causality here, but for some reason, the Adriatic didn't sail because of a coal strike. There's a coal strike happening in England, so the Adriatic didn't sail, so they ended up in the Titanic instead. Why doesn't the coal strike affect the Titanic? I have no idea. These are some of the details. Again, it's like how all of the pieces weave together, I don't exactly know. But this is them. So this picture of, these are pictures that clearly happened after they were already here. Because my grandfather was, again, around 7 years old, and his mother, my great-grandmother, was about 27 when they were on the ship. Okay, quickly. Okay, so one of the things they did when they were trying to immigrate to this country is they changed their last name to Moore. Because, as the family story goes, they thought it sounded British. And they were trying to hide their Jewish identity. They felt that if they were more hidden, they would have higher chances of being able to get into the country. That's a story of many people. That many of us do not have the last name that even our ancestors had 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 generations ago. I remember when I was in college, and I realized this, I put this together, I was about 18 years old, and I was upset. I was like, I'm so upset that I don't know what my real last name is. And I was talking to my good friend, Greg Cox, whose father is African American, and he said, Lee, my ancestors, we lost all of our names. We lost all of our names, And I was like, oh, right, I'm not the only one. Lots of people lose names. And that's a part of what it is to be in the diaspora. It's part of what it is to be from an immigrant family as well. So why did they survive? So they were coming across in third class. My dad will call it sometimes steerage. I don't know what that means exactly, steerage, right? But it means that they were in the bottom of the boats. Once my mom and brother and I went through a Titanic exhibit, at the very end, there were these lists of survivors. And it was very clear, you kind of stand there and behold these lists of survivors. And the list of the third class survivors was like much fewer. I don't know the details, but much, much fewer. There weren't that many people in third class that survived because it all happened so quickly. It was the middle of the night. They had to get somehow all the way from the bottom of the boat to the top to get on a lifeboat. My dad says that part of why they survived is that my great-grandmother was already awake. She couldn't sleep that night. And he believes she was on the deck even when the wrestling was starting, and that she went down to get my grandfather and then came back. We also have a family story through my father that there were these men in the stairwells that were like lifting her up. He remembers her saying this story that she was kind of being lifted up. And then, you know, speaking with my father in the last few days, he's like, that doesn't make any sense. Maybe that wasn't the case. Maybe that was something I made up. We don't know. But this idea of her being assisted during this flurry of save the women and children first, that's also when I was a young kid, I remember that idea of hearing this idea of save the women and children first. And I didn't understand why. Not that that's a bad thing, but I remember being a small child and hearing about that idea of women and children on the boat first. One of the other strong family stories that we have is that an elderly, wealthy woman gave up her seat on the boat, on the lifeboat, so that my grandmother and great-grandmother and grandfather could get on. And in fact, in the movie that came out in 1958, A Night to Remember, has anyone here seen that movie? It's the black and white first version of the Titanic sort of movie based on a book of the same title. There's a scene like that, where there's a woman who gives up her seat. More on that later, because it gets to be very interesting, this idea of who was this woman that gave up her seat? Was there a woman who gave up her seat? So a lot became revealed to us, as I mentioned before, in 2012, when the 100th anniversary was coming along. And this is my big dramatic moment, where I didn't want to do this before, this picture, which we didn't have before. So I will walk over to the... So this is my great-grandmother, Baila, and that's my grandfather, Meier. This picture was from an article in the Yiddish Vorwärts in April 19th, 1912, 4 days after the sinking of the Titanic. And the headline of the article is, "What the Rescued Jewish Immigrants Have to Say." So clearly, they were in New York City. They were taken from their lifeboat, they were taken onto the boat, the Carpathian, which was the boat that rescued folks. And I had no idea about this article. Nobody in my family knew about this article. It was there in the archive since 1912, but we didn't know. So to me, this picture and this article is one of the biggest gifts that came in the 100th anniversary, because not only do I have this picture of seeing them 4 days after, but I actually have a quote from my great-grandmother in that article. So I'd like now to read that to you, because to me this is such a gift, right? Like, how often do you just wake up one morning and then suddenly get to hear the intonation of your great-grandmother who you never knew because somebody wrote down something that she said? That to me was pretty exciting. It's a translation, of course, because the article was in Yiddish. She was speaking Yiddish. I'm going to read the translation into English. But I invite you, as I read this, to imagine, I can hear some of the Yiddish intonations, actually, in some of the ways that she uses words and the things that she says. So the reporter asked her, okay, I might need a little bit more light for this. Is that possible? I'm like, can you pause? Okay. Okay. Oh, a flashlight would be perfect. Okay, this is good. This is good. This works for folks. So So the reporter asked her, "How did you feel when you saw the accident?" Baila said, "I felt that my life was over, and I clutched my child tightly to myself and thought that whatever will be, will be." He asked, "Do you recall what took place around you?" She said, "Yes. People ran about wildly, as though mad. The sound of wailing voices was petrifying. At the time, one couldn't think about oneself much." He asked, "What did you feel once you were there in a lifeboat?" "I waited for death. None of us knew whether we would be found." He asked, "Did you see the ship sink?" She responded, "Who could look at the disaster? My child said to me, pointing at the sinking ship, 'Mother, mother, do you see? The lights are going out and the ship is plunging downward.'" So that's my grandfather who said that to his mom. So he saw, that's another thing I got from this. I know that he saw it go down. She continues, "But I turned my head away. It was alarming to watch. But having turned my glance to the other side, the scene was just as appalling. People were swimming about with despairing voices, with wild screaming. Everywhere you looked were the same terrifying images. If you closed your eyes, those fierce cries would lance your ears as they did mine. From every vantage point, death stared you in the eyes." This is what I have from my great-grandmother. Like, this is the quote of her from that moment. Yeah, and how these things go, you know, it's so strange. Like, she was around, she lived, she did all these things, but no one ever sort of stopped to say, "Let me write down something you're going to say." Right? So that's the legacy. So one of the things that you'll see if you go onto websites that are cataloging the disaster is this ticket, or inspection card, it says. So this is, it's the tickets, or maybe inspection card. Part of why my great-grandmother preserved these, she clutched these as well as her son to her heart, because she already had the experience of getting kicked out, right? Of not having, and we think it was because she didn't have the right paperwork, or she didn't have someone to vouch for her, whatever it is, this immigrant moment of not having the right thing. So she knew that these were really important. And so even as the boat was going down, she grabbed her purse because she knew she was going to need to have her officialness, whatever official thing. So these, and you can see how the Adriatic is crossed out because that's the boat they were originally supposed to be on, and instead they're on the Titanic. I think this is some kind of certifier of health or something like that, inspection card. I don't know, but anyway, you can see. And so how did I bring you this picture today is because it's online on a site. As you can see, I took a screenshot of it. I left some of the other parts of my computer screen just so you could see. It is kind of weird, like having something that is so personal yet be so interesting to other people that it's online. That's one of the themes for me of this story. Okay. Yes. Oh, in fact, it's from the Encyclopedia Titanica, which totally is like a whole thing. It has profiles on every person that survived, and for sure some of the things it says aren't true. So I'll just say that. You can't trust websites on these things. But again, it's that same theme of like wanting to tell the story. Like, what's the story here? There's such a big story with Titanic. What's the particular story of this person? One of the stories that we have about my grandfather, a 7-year-old boy, he was very excited about these cards that were in cigarette packages at the time in 1912. And he would just boldly go up to grown-ups that he didn't know that were smoking and say, "Can I have that card that's from your cigarette package?" I guess the card was used to like keep the cigarettes all in line or something like that because the packages were soft. And they had pictures on them of things like cowboys and Indians, for example. But when I was talking to my father has since like come to want to collect these. My dad likes collecting things. So the cowboys and Indians, and in my father's imagination, it was the cowboys and Indian ones that he liked the best. But I asked him, is that because of is this something Poppy told you, or is that because of you thinking of this? And he's not sure. Which again is okay. It's all right. But there's I found another site about my grandfather that clearly has my father's influence on it, which again is also okay, in terms of the way the stories come down. So what happened afterwards to my grandfather and great-grandmother? We took this last name from Moore. To his dying day, my grandfather never told us what the last name was. Maybe he didn't know, maybe it was part of the trauma of, his mother saying to him, "Don't tell anyone, our name is now Moore," and then this horrible thing happens, like going down in the boat. Who knows, maybe that's part of what sealed it for him. This is at my grandfather's home in Texas, where he and my grandmother eventually ended up. The man in the middle is my father, who I've spoken about a few times. I am the little one being held by my mother, and my brother is kind of there right next to my grandmother, and my grandmother in the bottom right-hand corner, my nanny, who would be thrilled that I'm at a JCC right now talking about all of this. You have no idea how excited this would make her. So here are some Moors. There are other Moors. My grandfather went on with my grandmother to have 3 sons. My father is the middle of those 3. First, though, he and my great-grandmother went to Montreal, where they lived for a little while, and then from Montreal to Chicago, and lived in Chicago through the 1930s, and that's where my grandfather met my grandmother. Her parents had been immigrants from Poland, and Baila got remarried to a man named Trezon. And Meier married my grandmother, had 3 kids. In the late 1940s, they moved to El Paso, Texas. My grandmother had rheumatoid arthritis, and the family story again was that the weather the dry weather helped her arthritis. My Poppy passed away in 1975. What is very, interesting detail is the day that he finally passed away, April 15th, 1975, was the 63rd anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. So that's just, numbers, right? How the numbers line up. So these are some Moors. Myself, my brother, my mom, my dad, my Poppy, my nanny. And here are some other Moors. This was, I think, 1976. And that's me and my brother. My brother is wearing the baseball hat, and my 2 cousins. So as far as my grandfather's progeny, these are the 4 grandchildren that he had. And this is taken about 1 year after his death. So my cousins, Ian and Cheney, in the front. Ian is an extraordinary musician and of some fame, especially in Austin, Texas, where he grew up. And so at various points, like media outlets would do a story on, did you know Ian Moore, who's this famous guitar player, his grandfather was on the Titanic. So oftentimes, I get like clippings from my grandmother of these articles and that kind of thing. So that's one layer of this. And my brother, Christopher, who is in Rhode Island, he's a neuroscientist. My cousin Jamie is also involved in the music industry. So I want to talk a little bit about transformation. So Baila, first of all, she changed her name to Bella. And Moor, which they initially spelled M-O-O-R, they changed to spell M-O-O-R-E. What my father and uncles remembered about Baila was that she was very elegant, that she had a kind of a sense of style. This on the on the left is her with her second husband, Trezon, in Chicago. On the right with her 3 grandchildren. So that's my father on the far right, my Uncle Ira, who might be watching right now, on the left, top, and on the bottom left is my Uncle Ralph, Alava Shalom. Baila, she stayed very connected throughout her life to her cousins in Montreal, which I only really realized long after my grandmother passed away, and I'm going through pictures and seeing picture after picture of these cousins in Montreal. Like, there are so many of them and the names, and now, thanks to Ancestry.com, trying to weave that together, finding she had siblings, for example. But like, that part of the family story was completely lost. I didn't know that my great-grandmother had siblings. There was just this sense that they somehow transported, and again, I think this often can happen of things getting lost through the generations. My Uncle Ralph, even at one point, researched a little bit, like maybe she was Anastasia. I don't know if you've heard of Anastasia, like the lost princess, which doesn't make any sense at all because she was Jewish, but maybe that was a cover. I think he even went to Russia once to like research this. But the themes of mystery and lostness, you know, also echo in that story. When the 100th anniversary happened, there was a 100th anniversary voyage of some ship that was like, as if it was the Titanic. There was a wealthy Romanian on this voyage who was like obsessed with the Titanic. And he, in looking over the lists of all of the passengers, saw Baila and Meier and said, oh my gosh, they're Romanian. They were listed as Romanian in the, you know, we've got to get to the bottom of this. Who are these people? So he contracted a lovely Romanian journalist. This woman was just amazing. Her name was Mihaela Bilios. Sorry, Mihaela, if I butchered your Romanian last name. So as the 100th anniversary got closer, she reached out to my family and said, I have been commissioned to find out more about your ancestors. We're so excited because this is the only connection between the Titanic and Romania. And can I please interview you, and can I do this research? And I, to be honest, my first response was, slow down. Like, they were not actually Romanian, right? That's part of the problem. They were running away from your country because of anti-Semitism. They were trying to get away. They weren't actually, they were Jewish, you know, and she, bless her, she was so sensitive to this and really open. And she said, yes, I understand, and let's just try to tell her story. She spent the better part of, I don't know, about 6 months doing research on my family, which was neat because she confirmed, for example, that there were no Moors. There were no Jewish Moors anywhere in any of the areas. So that helps us to know that, yes, probably this was a made-up name. She uncovered very interesting things, like the fact that those folks who were immigrating to this country actually were granted citizenship when they first arrived, because my dad would say it's the only time in US history this has happened. I don't know what the case is, I haven't researched it, but this idea that those folks who were survivors of the Titanic actually got US citizenship, they were just granted it. But my grandfather and great-grandmother didn't know this. So they were in Montreal for a while. As I said, they were in Chicago, ended up in El Paso. In 1950, from El Paso, they went through a long, arduous process of applying for citizenship, which was great because when Mihaela, the journalist from Romania, found these documents, it gave us so much information that we hadn't had before. We didn't even know these documents were out there. The irony being that they were already actually granted citizenship, but they didn't know it, and so they went through this whole process in 1950. Also, to some degree, because that was the Red Scare time, right? The McCarthyism. One of the family stories that my grandmother's sister, my Aunt Sunny, would tell was that Baila was totally like a socialist Bolshevik. I don't know, she was super into that side of things. And this is part of why my dad's first and middle name are Karl Marcus, is because he was named after Karl Marx. And I'm like, wow, Aunt Sunny, I had no idea, you know? But it may have been some fear around that. There was a lot of anti-Russian Jewish sentiment in the 1950s, right? I don't have to give all the history here. So this could have been part of why they then went to take the steps toward becoming a citizen, which was a long, arduous process that maybe they didn't need to. So Meier changed his name, or the spelling of it, from M-E-I-E-R to M-E-Y-E-R. In the left-hand side, he is in the bottom right-hand corner. And this, on the back, it's scrawled in Yiddish, Meier with his cousins. I want to give a shout out to Chaya Kessler, who some of you probably know. Chaya came over one day and helped me look through my great-grandmother's pictures to translate all the Yiddish. And even that helped me get a lot more information, which was awesome. And then this is Meier in looks like the 1950s or 60s, standing in his store in El Paso, Texas. He ended up becoming a store owner. Like, he and my great-grandmother, they had stores. So in Chicago they had a store, in El Paso they had a store. My father says the real name for what my grandfather did and loved to do was a jobber. He liked like finding things that were like on like bulk things that you could get at a deal and then turn around and then sell them. And it was always, he was always angling for like the deal. And yeah, he liked gambling too, which jobbing to some degree is kind of like gambling. Like you invest in one thing and you see how it does. What kind of value can you get out of a thing? So yeah, I really love this picture of him standing in front of his wares. Like his stance is just very, compelling. He was kind of drawn to these trade for sure. He was a tradesman in that sense of really liking trade. My Uncle Ralph really took after him in that sense, and he would trade all kinds of things. Whole other story. And he's a man who really grew up without a father, as many, many people grow up without fathers. That's a big theme in ancestral work. As I mentioned before, in Chicago, he met my grandmother, Henrietta. My grandmother was very, very unique human, really interesting. She was very male identified. She was a ham radio license operator. There's one of the first female ham radio license operators in the country. She knew Morse code. I could say a lot more about her, but that's not the topic today, so I won't do that. But just to say, of course, their marriage and connection was a huge part of my family and part of my grandfather's life. They both were a little older when they got married. In the 1930s, he was well into his 30s and she was in her late 20s when they got married. They loved to travel, and that's, I think in the bottom left, that's their honeymoon, a trip that they took to Wisconsin or something like that. And this picture on the bottom right, so that's my Uncle Ralph, their first child, and I just love, this is my grandmother's handwriting, the Moore family, and Moore is in quotes. I just think it's so interesting, like why is it in quotes, right? It's just the Moore family, but I think even this idea, they were both very unconventional people for their time in different ways. My grandmother, her nickname was Hank. She was, her original name had been Etta, but she changed it to Henrietta, and then she went by Hank. She was just very male identified, and my grandfather, they were just really these unconventional people, and I feel like part of why the name might be in quotes is simply because, really, we made a family here? Are we family people? Is that what's happening? I don't know. I'd be curious to hear what other folks in my family would say about that. They love to travel. Nanny and Poppy, this is them at some formal occasion on the left, and on the right, Fortune Club, Las Vegas, going to Las Vegas to gamble, and the cigar. Oh, did you see the cigar in the other picture? Do you see in the bottom right-hand corner, my Poppy holding the cigar in his hand, I don't know, there's something about him with the cigar that it's very much, there are a lot of pictures of him with the cigar. Okay, so March 14th, 2012, I had been working on an event that was going to happen in New York City on March 14th, 2012. I was working for, as some of you may know, the Canfor family in Akron, doing Jewish philanthropy, and I had been planning this event for months and months and months. I had no idea that the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic was going to be such a big deal. No idea at all. And I get this call from People magazine. And they say, we're doing a photo shoot of survivors, descendants of survivors of the Titanic. And I'm like, well, that's lovely, but like, what does that have to do with me? I'm not gonna go, And they said, well, we just were wondering, is there any chance, and this was in early March, they said, is there any chance that anyone in your family would be in New York City on March 14th? And I was like, well, actually, yes. I've been planning this event that's happening in March 14th forever. But I can't come to your photo shoot. I'm going to be working. I've got like a thing going on. And so I said, I'm sorry. And they said, well, just think about it. Even if you could come for a couple hours, maybe over a lunch break. So I looked at the map. The photo shoot was happening at a place called the Jane Hotel, which apparently this is where many of the Titanic survivors, like the well-to-do ones, would congregate in the many years after their experience, just to have kind of like a reunion society of people who survived the Titanic. And the place where the event was happening, where I was at, was literally a 5-minute drive from the Jane Hotel. And I thought, this is crazy. It's just lining up too perfectly. Okay, I'll do your thing. So, so I ended up being in People magazine. There's a whole thing, I'm not gonna have time for that. So first, I do wanna say that this idea about stories and family stories that I think is very important. There's really interesting research by a psychologist named Marshall Duke out of Emory University who talks about the way that families tell stories is one of the strongest indicators around whether a young person feels a sense of resiliency or not. And what he argues, and his research is fascinating, really worth looking into, it doesn't matter if the stories are, we had these horrible things happen to us. What matters is that the family tells the story and tells it often, and that this creates a sense of a strong intergenerational self, that we then come to know ourselves not just as who we are, just this, but someone with connections, somebody that belongs. So this is one of my theories as to why the Titanic story is so compelling to people, is because it hits, these are his 7 categories of types of family stories. It hits so many of them. Overcoming the monster, like surviving something, some big threat. A quest, right? It has that involved in it as well. A quest across the water, voyage and return, rags to riches, tragedy, comedy, rebirth. Not time to go into all of this, but yeah, in my reflection on like why is it that this Titanic story is so compelling when so many things have happened in history, right? So many different pieces. So yeah, this is my grandfather and my grandmother and my great-grandmother in the dry goods store in El Paso that my grandfather had. And I like this picture because it shows it's kind of dark, in there, and it's kind of just a bunch of stuff for sale. It's nothing special. Class is also one of the big frames around these Titanic stories. Part of why I think many people were interested in my family's story in the 100th anniversary is because all the stories of all of the rich people had already been told. Over and over and over again, right? And there was this idea, can we find a story that hasn't been told yet? So that's part of how they found my family. Now, how did People magazine know to call me? They knew to call me because of the Strauss Family Foundation. So remember I mentioned this idea that my grandfather or somebody had this idea that a wealthy woman gave up her seat in a lifeboat, and that's how my grandfather and great-grandmother survived. This story matches the story of Ida and Isidore Strauss. Have you ever heard the story of Ida and Isidore Strauss? Raise your hand. Some people have. Okay, so they owned Macy's. And Ida, very famously, an elderly, wealthy woman, gave up her seat and said, I've lived my whole life with my husband, I will die with him too. And they both went down the Titanic together. There's a park in the Upper West Side of Manhattan dedicated to them. It's this very strong story. So, of course, at some point in my family, we started wondering, I wonder if that was the woman who gave up her seat. Spoiler alert, probably not. So, at the end of the day, but what happened in the year 2012 was this was like a story. It was like a new story. Nobody had exactly heard, right? So at some point, even long before this, the Strauss Family Foundation had reached out to my family and said, oh, we heard that your grandfather had this. Wouldn't that be neat? Let's stay connected. And so I'm pretty sure that's how People Magazine got my number, was through the connection with the Strauss Family Foundation. And again, as my father and I were reflecting on this, even though we realized that this is probably not, and there was one reporter who made it his job to disprove this ever could have happened, and he showed how my ancestors were on lifeboat number 14, and they were on lifeboat, they would have been on a different side of the ship, and people get geeky about this stuff, right? But he was like, oh, I've got to disprove this, lest anyone think this might actually be true, and it's like, okay, I guess it's not true, no big deal. But it was getting some attention, and so again, I think that's how people found me. So this is, I'm probably not supposed to show this picture even, because see how it says Getty Images? I just found it online, took a screenshot. This was the photo shoot. It was pretty surreal. I did my morning of meetings. I got in a car, I took a taxi over to the Jane Hotel. This person, all of the other people had already been dressed and made up and everything. They took me to this room of the Jane Hotel that was turned into as if it was a clothing studio, and I had already sent in my measurements and everything, and they had this dress picked out for me, and I was like, okay. And I've never done this in my life. I had 2 people on my makeup and 2 people on my hair, and then boom, I was the last one, and then we went into this room and did the photo shoot. It was very surreal. And then, of course, I was only there for about an hour and a half, and then I took a ride back to the meeting I had been at, and a couple of people were like, you look a little different than you did. And I'm like, yeah, I just did a photo shoot for People Magazine. I mean, it was the most bizarre thing. And I'll say also, when this came out, my cousin and my cousin's wife, she wrote me and she was really upset. She was like, well, my kids are descendant too. Why weren't they in the photo shoot? And I was like, oh my gosh, well, it was so random that I was even there. It was just, but I can understand, where she'd be coming from. There's a certain energy around it, and I don't know, it was so random. And so then CBS Sunday Morning, does anybody watch CBS Sunday Morning? It's a TV show. I had never heard of it before, but they were looking for an angle, and the Strauss Family Foundation was gonna have an event. And so they had me come to New York to come to this event, and then CBS Sunday Morning was there, and they interviewed me, and then I was on TV. So this is me at a friend of mine's house in Cleveland, watching it that morning. It was all very surreal, but and now it's done, right? Because the media's on to other things. I mean, it's how these things go. It's just kind of strange. One other, for me, really great outcome of this was new family connections, because somebody then sees the CBS Sunday Morning thing. So Harvey Himberg, who's all the way on the left, he and his brother Philip, their grandfather was was Baila's nephew, and they, there's family connection. Anyway, they reached out and said, hey, we're related. Harvey remembered when Baila came to visit them. They grew up in Connecticut. It was sometime in the 50s, and he remembered 2 things. One was that she had been on the Titanic, and the other was that she brought them cowboy outfits from Texas. And this cowboy outfit from Texas was the coolest thing that he'd ever seen, because he was, about a 7-year-old boy, something like that. So it was really neat just to find out, oh, cousins, didn't realize. And then there ended up being quite a connection, because Philip's daughter, Fanny, right when we got connected, was just about to graduate from Oberlin, which is, of course, not too far away from Kent, where I was living at the time. So their whole family was coming together for Fanny's graduation, and I showed up, and I remember being worried, what what if they're kind of normal people? I mean, my family, we're really unconventional, we're kind of strange, we're kind of unconventional, you know? I just had this sense of like, what if we're, I don't know, like what if we're just really different or something? And they turned out to be quite unconventional as well. Fanny was one of the first kids raised by two fathers in the 1990s, and she actually has 5 fathers. It's a long story, but Philip is one of them. Julia is Harvey's daughter. It was just really wonderful to like gain from this whole thing a sense of additional family that I didn't know about. So I'm closing in on my remarks, and there will be some time for question and answer, but I had to show pictures of my father's bar mitzvah. In part because my dad would probably hate it, but this is my dad and his mom, my nanny, and then there's Baila and Meier with my nanny, and it's also, this was one of the last big events of Baila's life. She passed away in 1958, January of 1958, this was probably 1955, and I find it a bit ironic, she passed in January 58, A Night to Remember, the movie I mentioned before. The US release was in December of 1958. My father says he has a letter of correspondence. They definitely consulted with her as they were making the movie to ask if she had remembrances. So there's that. And these I had to show, because these were in my great-grandmother's set of pictures. You know how pictures can be like in a stack, and there's you know, there's one from the 50s and one from the 80s, and they're just all kind of together, or at least that's how it is in my family. So these two pictures were really close to each other, and I just have to point this out, because it seems to me that this is why. So at the bottom, that's Meier, my grandfather, and it says the name, again, scrawled in Yiddish on the back of the guy he's with. It's either a friend or a cousin, something like that. The top is his 3 sons. My dad is on the left, my Uncle Ralph in the middle, and my Uncle Ira on the right. And I just think if you look at my dad on the left there, and you look at my grandfather on the left, this similarity is just so striking. Just the way that they're standing, the way their hair is. I don't know, something about that was really compelling for me. Just again thinking how these things come passed down. I wanted to show, so these are the three sons of my papi. So there's my father and I in the past couple of years in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he lives. My Uncle Ira, who I've mentioned a few times, he lives in the Netherlands. And my Uncle Ralph, Alava Shalom, who passed away. And he's the one who really inherited the trader, wheeler-dealer aspect of my grandfather. And there he is in his home in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And his 2 sons, Ian and Jamie, are there. Ian is the amazing guitar player, and then Ian has 2 sons, Max and Levi. And what I'm sad about is there is no picture of all of us together in my family, because that's another thing that happens. It takes a certain amount of energy of a certain kind and willingness and everything to get everybody together. Okay, so you just listened to me talk about my family for almost an hour. Are there any questions that have come up? If anybody's interested, yeah, let's open the lights. We have a few minutes for questions. Yes?
Yeah, so just hearing you make that comment there, so you never had any family reunion?
You know, the closest thing we had to a family reunion was my grandmother's 90th birthday. And everybody was there except for me, because I happened to be in India that semester in college. So they all, but no, there's never been a time where all of us have actually been together. And it feels like it's, you know, my family's not the only way like this, but it's a bit split, you know, there's like a cohesion. It's not quite there like it is in some other families. Thanks for your question. Yes?
I might have missed this. What was your grandfather's name before they
Meier.
changed it to Meier? To Moore?
Well, it was just spelled M-E-I-E-R, and he changed it to M-E-Y-E-R.
That's his first name.
Yes.
What was his last name?
We don't know.
Oh.
Yeah, they changed it to Moor because they
Right,
thought they would be
right.
like less identified as Jews.
Oh, okay. Was that before they went on the Titanic?
Definitely because their Titanic registry on the ship's logs them as Moor.
Okay.
Yeah, and it makes the genealogy harder because we don't have the last
Right.
name. Yes.
When they went to England, maybe there's some records of England with them.
Yes, and in fact, one of the things I found in the last few days was a name of somebody that they stayed with in England, and so that could be a further direction to possibly get more information. Yes.
Was it really hard, getting all the information together, or did doors that seem to open up? Was it really hard in getting all the information from, like way back, or did doors that seem to fall in place and open up, where different information came to you?
It's so interesting because I'm fascinated by the way that you'll have just a little bit, you just know a little bit, and then something else comes, and then something else comes, and I feel like it's still happening like that. I actually feel like we're still going to find more information. One of the biggest questions is where my great-grandmother and grandfather were living before they left, from the pogroms. So my brother and I talk about this a lot, actually, and have the different theories and different, but I still feel like we might be able to find out more. So it's, to me, I delight every time there's a bit more of information that you find. And that is like heartening, it's part of the process. Yes.
Because my family, because my family, our last name's Furcar, and it's kind of a different name, you don't hear it every day. And so I would like to find out how do I start to get information to look up some of my ancestry. So, my mom, she used to diligently seek her family members, and we used to go all over the place, to find her family. So I would kind of like to pick up that trait, that trail. But, most of the elderly ones that know the information are deceased, and the young ones, they're not really interested.
Exactly, right? This is what can happen. I mean, the fact that my great-grandmother had all these cousins in Montreal, but my dad and his brothers, like, maybe they had that as a thought, but like, who are those people and what are their names? And these kind of things can get lost in families unless there is somebody who really wants to make sure that it gets maintained. I was so heartened that Harvey Himberg reached out to us, His daughter didn't necessarily do that, or his brother. It's because I think there's someone in the family who wants this and then puts effort into it. It seems like that's a big part of it. I'll say in my own journey, Ancestry.com is pretty great. There's a lot of records on there, and that's where I've been lately finding a lot more information.
They're constantly adding more records to Ancestry.com.
Yes.
So sometimes you look there and there's nothing, and then a month later you look again and it's there.
Yeah.
So don't give up if you look at one time and it's not there.
One of the things I just found yesterday in preparing for this was a list of Jewish men who were conscripted into the Russian army for the Russian-Japanese War. Now, sadly, we don't have my great-grandfather's last name. But I sent that to my dad and my brother, and it's like a list of 2,500 people, which isn't that long. But, my brother's like, well, maybe let's look at the ones that start with M. I mean, you take the tiniest little bit of what you might think and use your own hunches to then try to take it to the next step. I notice you're standing closer. Yes.
Someone from our live feed
Yes.
was asking if you have any plans to write these stories down in a book.
That's funny. No, I don't. But I'll say though, there is a part of me, so one of the other things that happened in the last few days, seeing the articles that are online and seeing, again, people love stories, right? So they want to make things sound interesting, but that can sometimes lead to things becoming unfactual. And there are things that are written on the internet about my family that are just simply not true. So I actually wrote yesterday a letter to the editor of a piece that came out in 2012, but I just felt like I had to set the record right. And I recognize that if you want to set the record right, then you have to do that work sometimes of actually writing it or publishing it so that there is an authoritative version of the story.
Well, what was it that they said that was not true?
Oh, well, it's a long story, but I mean, they said there were 3 things. Oh, maybe this is the thing I'll end on, because it's a human interest moment, I think. The first thing was they got my grandfather's birthday wrong. I don't know why they even mentioned his birthday, but they said November 7th, and it was actually November 15th. The second thing was how this whole piece was portrayed about the relationship between the Strauss Family Foundation and my dad, and they made it sound like it developed in a certain way that it hadn't, and so I wanted to clarify that. And the third, I'll say, you know, in my own, like, this is not the topic again of this talk, but my own Jewish journey of getting, you know, so involved in my Judaism, I become a rabbi, right? This is like a huge part of my life. Less so for my dad and his brothers, right? So a lot of my Jewish connection has been reclaimed, has been really through my own path. And when I was born, my nanny really wanted me to be named Baila, after my great-grandmother. And she actually went to my other grandmother, my mom's mom, and negotiated and said, let's make sure this girl is named after her 2 great-grandmothers. So I was supposed to be named Baila Louise, or Bella Louise. And they went to my mother and said, we think you should name your daughter Bella Louise. And she said, no. But I also didn't receive a Hebrew name, because that wasn't something that was part of my family story. You know, in the 1970s in Kent, Ohio, and this intermarried family. And so when it became very important to me to have a Hebrew name, you know, to be called to the Torah for various ritual things, I thought to myself, well, my grandmother wanted me to be named Baila. So that's really makes more sense to me than anything. I could go into the Torah and take some groovy Hebrew name, or I could actually reclaim the name that was kind of intended for me at birth, and that was Baila. So that's what I use for my Jewish name, is Baila, after her. And there was a detail about that the article got wrong, and I was upset about that, because it's my name. I think that's a good place to, is there more time for question? I think that's a good place to close. Yeah. I hope that this was interesting, and as I said at the beginning, I really hope most that this helps you to just open doors of your own family stories, of, you know, just seeing the ways that those are important, and to tell the stories. It's so important to tell the stories to all of the parts, so that we can really claim our intergenerational selves, so that we can know that we belong and know that we're connected. Thank you.
I saw this list, I thought, oh, just something to get out of it.